One of the reasons I really love being an adolescent developmental scientist is because it gives me a chance to reflect back on my own developmental journey. I realized that it's really fitting that I became somebody who studies this topic, because the very first research topic that I was ever interested in retrospect, was stereotypes. Way back when I was in 7th grade, I started becoming really interested in social stereotypes and why people make assumptions about other people, how people living in the same families and communities could interpret their social worlds so differently. It made me very angry at the time, which was very typical of a teenage boy. But I just wanted to understand. I had righteous anger about, why do we have gender stereotypes? How come people are supposed to act in certain ways? How can we make assumptions about what people value? So as an adolescent researcher, it feels appropriate, because what group of people is stereotyped more than teenagers? That's kind of a question for you, but kind of a rhetorical question at the same time. What group is more stereotyped than teenagers? So think about all of the different things that we assume the second we hear the word teenager. And so my first question to you is, are they more positive? Are they more negative? What do you think of when you think about teenager? Yeah. Negative? Yeah. Can you give an example? That they're lazy? Yeah.
I would say positive.
Positive, okay.
Charming.
That they're charming. Yeah?
I feel like there's more actively negative assumptions about teenage girls and more passively positive assumptions about teenage boys. Sort of
Working hypothesis. I like it. I like it. Mm-hmm. So one of the pervasive stereotypes about adolescence, it's that it's this time of storm and stress. It's this time of high risk and lots of problems relative to childhood and adulthood. And the way that we're used to thinking about it is almost like we're traversing this high wire. We have all of these changes going on, and we've got spinning plates we're trying to balance, and you've got new social experiences, and you're going to school and figuring out broader and more complex environments. Your acne's coming online. And you're starting to explore new behaviors that your parents might not want you to. So a lot is going on that could tip you off of that high wire and into some pervasive problems. That's the stereotype. But in reality, most teens, most of the time, get across that wire without major problems. Most people are fine most of the time. What I'm interested in as a researcher is in that subgroup of teens who experience such chronic stress and adversity that they might not have a net to catch them when they fall. I think we owe it to ourselves to come up with some definitions. So when we talk about adolescent risk and resilience, even saying that phrase, we have to make a lot of assumptions. Well, what is an adolescent? When does that time begin? When does it end? What is risk? What is resilience? We ultimately, as social researchers, don't have correct or incorrect answers to these. And so if you're somebody in the health sciences who loves math and loves correct answers to questions, I got nothing for you today. I'm sorry. But we do have to come up with some kind of consensus definition as a group. So the Society for Research on Adolescence has gotten together many times over the years to try to define and shape what we think of when we think of the beginning of adolescence. And the consensus definition right now is that it's really this time that coincides with the beginning of puberty. So it's a biological entry point. As soon as the brain, the hypopituitary adrenal axis in your brain sends signals to your body to start producing more hormones and to start producing acne, that's pretty much when adolescence is starting. Now, when does it end? That is the tricky question. So when does an adolescent become an adult? So the easy way to think about it is that adulthood emerges when you start to assume adult roles. So it's a social boundary. So right away, things are getting really dicey. So the beginning of adolescence is a biological boundary, but the end of adolescence is this socio-cultural boundary. And so when we think about emerging as an adult, well, who gets to decide what an adult role is? So it's culturally constructed, and we can reconstruct it. Adolescence as a term is not even more than about 110 years old. Certainly, people have been teenagers, for all of human history. It's not a period that we just used to skip. But the way that we think about it, the hallmarks in our collective cultural consciousness, the prom dates, and the time spent at the mall, which is now going away, are very, very recent. It really wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we started to think about adolescence as this distinctive period that's separate from childhood and adulthood. People started migrating away from rural areas and moving into the cities to work in the industrial facilities. So they would bring their kids with them. Unfortunately, there was a lot of exposure to child labor during the late 1800s. Progressive movements were established in order to bring the children out of those environments and to do something else with them. That's when we started having things like high schools. And so it was basically this new idea that adolescence is this distinctive period that's worthy of protection, and that it's also worthy of empirical studies. We are trying to understand, what is it about this period that makes it special? What is it about this period that makes it a time of heightened risk for behavioral and mental health problems? But also, what is it about this period that makes it unique for opportunities? So you tell me, what are some things that change in our teens? It's a lot of moving parts. What are some of them? Okay, biological changes, for sure. Anything specific? Secondary sexual characteristics, yes. And primary.
Social structures.
Social structures change. You start to experience new environments, perhaps. The transition from primary school, where you're with the same teacher and the same 30 students every day, suddenly you're in middle and high school, and your world has expanded exponentially. What else? You must remember, I'm looking at your faces, you can't be far removed from adolescence if you're maybe
Degrees of freedom.
more autonomy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like my son gets himself to school. He does his homework. I don't even know what to do anymore. He just does it.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're expected to regulate your emotions more than previously?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your emotional life changes considerably, and your ability to regulate your emotions changes.
Some people can realize that traumas they're experiencing aren't normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perhaps that comes from the ability to kind of decentrate. And when we're younger, we're very much in our own heads, and it's really hard to think about perspectives outside of our own. But as we see that other people can experience the world differently from us, we might start to realize that maybe we're not being treated fairly. Yeah, awesome. Well, I am a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm going to unpack that for you, but I want to start with the neuroscience part. So now that we've talked about all of these things that are changing, the brain is really a central spoke in the wheel that drives many of these changes. We know as neuroscientists that it's these neurodevelopmental milestones that typify adolescence that are driving emotional changes. It's the brain that is really driving our incentive to expand social environments, and it's certainly the brain that is triggering many of the pubertal changes that give us such grief. And so in order to study these multitudes of changes occurring, we really have to start with the brain. So as social scientists, we actually borrow a lot of knowledge now from basic neuroscience. So what is neuroscience? At its most basic, neuroscience is the scientific study of the nervous system. And when we talk about the nervous system, there are really just two primary components to it. There's the brain and the spinal cord that make up the central part. So the brain, as we know, is in the skull, and then the spinal cord is connected to it. Within our brain, we have a very intricate collection of what are called neurons. Neurons are essentially cells. They act like cells from all other parts of your body. So if you remember from 9th grade biology, cells have nuclei and cytoplasm, etc. The cells in your brain have all of those same things, but we call them neurons. And the average human has about 86 billion of these in the brain. The vast majority of them are in the back. The overwhelming majority of the neurons in your brain are in the back of your head. Turns out this is the most important part. The farther back you are, the more important for primary functions. So in the back of your brain, you have control over your coordinated movements, swallowing, walking, breathing. And then as you move toward the front, we have fewer neurons, but the farther forward you go, in a general sense, the more higher cognitive those functions become. So it's actually thought that when we look at cross-species research, that the backs of our brains are the ones that are most similar to other species. And it's the fronts of our brains that are the newest to develop in the course of evolution. And so as a whole species, we're kind of in our adolescence because we're still developing our ability to use our prefrontal cortices. But adolescents especially are new to some of these developmental processes. And in particular, when we look at brain changes that occur during adolescence, there are two primary shifts that occur. One is everything in the green here. One is in the prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is a part of your brain that is really, really important for all aspects of cognitive processing. So planning for the future, thinking about the consequences of your actions, complex thinking, so being able to reverse the alphabet in your mind. So the prefrontal cortex is really important for cognitive control. And if you think about your brain sort of as a car, what the prefrontal cortex stands for is the brakes. It's that part of your brain that says, this might be a dumb thing to do, don't do it. the limbic system is also developing in this age range. When we look at the purple, the limbic region roughly corresponds to motivated action. The limbic system is super active when you're in your teen years. It is propelling you forward toward seeking out high sensation experiences. It's the part of your brain that motivates you to seek rewards. It's the part of your brain that really wants to hang out with your friends and maybe try some risky things. It's the part of your brain, if we continue our car analogy, that can be thought of as the gas. And so both the gas and the brakes in your brain are developing at rapid rates when you're in the adolescent years. The problem is they develop at different rates. So when we look at the limbic system, the part of your brain that serves as the gasoline, it's pretty much fully developed and becoming super active by around 15 years of age on average. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex has a much more prolonged developmental period. It's not really becoming fully developed until around the age of 25 on average. And so you have this unique period of a developmental mismatch where you're learning to drive the car of your own body, but the gasoline works a lot better than the brakes. If that doesn't sound like an adolescent, I don't know what does. So that's kind of one of the hallmarks of adolescent neurodevelopment that motivates a lot of our research on things like high risk-taking behaviors, substance use, for example. It's also a model that motivates the research we do on the onset of mental health problems in adolescence. The thinking is that this is also a period of heightened emotional experience that is driven by the limbic system. But because our prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, our ability to regulate those emotional experiences is deficient still. So it's a really useful model for understanding some of those hallmarks, some of those stereotypes that we carry about adolescence. At the same time, so stepping outside of the brain, another thing that happens in this age range is we have this reorienting away from wanting to spend time with caretakers and toward our friends. Sounds intuitive, but what neuroscience has revealed to us is the why and the how of this. And so we call this the social reorientation in the brain. As your prefrontal cortex is continuing to develop, you are becoming more autonomous, and so you're wanting to spend less time with your parents and more time with peers. You are also becoming more sensitive to experiences that you have with your peers. It's thought that because of that super active limbic system that undergirds emotional experiences in your brain, you are beginning to ascribe much higher value in things like being liked and avoiding social rejection, avoiding embarrassment. The brain is really central in all of those social experiences. We call that social neuroscience. And so when you bring these two changes together, when we think about this developmental mismatch, where we have heightened emotionality and heightened reward seeking at the same time that we have deficient cognitive control and regulatory abilities, we're also experiencing this shift where we care much more about being liked and being accepted by high-value peers. The thinking is that when you bring those two changes together, there's something about the sensitivity to social experiences that might be playing a role in the heightened onset of mental and behavioral health problems that we see in adolescence. Indeed, this is a time when youth who were initially susceptible or at risk for the development of emotion disorders like depression and anxiety start to reach that clinical threshold. It's often in the age range of about 9 to 13 that a kid first gets a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, social anxiety. We think this might have something to do with this intersection of the developing brain and social changes that act as stressors in our lives. And so this really is the central question of my research. But how do we look at this? How do we figure out what the role of the brain is in the influence of social experiences on health? How do we study the teen brain? We use a technique called developmental cognitive neuroscience. It sounds like a mouthful, but when we break it down word to word, it's pretty simple. Developmental means we study changes. Cognitive means we study thinking and information processing. And then neuroscience means we study the brain. So when you put it all together, developmental cognitive neuroscientists like me study changes in the way that people think and the role of the brain in guiding those changes. One of the most popular methods for studying these phenomena is magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. What we do is we invite adolescents to come to the hospital and undergo an MRI where we take pictures of their brain. Most of them find it really fun. They're excited to come. When I was recruiting for my own study at OHSU last year, I had a lot of teenagers reaching out to me saying, I don't even care about the money that I'm getting. I just want a picture of my brain. So they come in. We actually give them a picture of their brain to take home, and it's super rad. And it looks like the one on the right. And so what we do is that we take them into the MRI, and then we have them do activities. And we can actually look at patterns of blood flow in their brain as they're engaging in certain daily life experiences. Quick sidebar, the grayer areas that you see in this picture are called gray matter. And those are where all of your neurons live, those cells in your brain. So those engage you in all of your life functions. The whiter areas are called white matter. And those are like the highway systems in your brain. White matter tracks are really important for speedy and efficient communication between the neurons of your brain. And so that white matter is increasing when you're an adolescent. And so your ability to do things rapidly and efficiently and flexibly is increasing. That's why I really try to stay away from only talking about the risks and the negatives about adolescence, because it's also this really amazing period of maximal abilities in some ways. Think about Olympic athletes. The average age of many Olympic athletes is young adulthood. End of sidebar. So we develop tasks for them to complete when they're in the scanner, and that allows us to look at moment-to-moment changes in blood flow in their brain as they're engaging in experiences that simulate daily life. I'll show you a couple of examples. One of the experiences that I've been interested in the past few years is the influence of negative social experiences on mental and behavioral health, and what role the brain plays in that relationship. So I did my PhD dissertation looking at experiences of peer victimization in adolescent girls over a period of from 9 years old through 17 years old. And what I really wanted to find out was, we're kind of living in this era now where we spend most of our time on our phones, and so there are new opportunities to make friends and self-disclose, but there are also new risks. For example, cyberbullying. And so many of the manners in which we're sort of monitoring and discovering our social status is via online mediation. So think about monitoring how many likes you're getting on a social media platform. Or for those of you who have ever been in the dating scene, think about Tinder, where you're swiping right and swiping left on people, and maybe finding out whether somebody liked you or not. So I wanted to look at how negative experiences in online platforms are taking place in the brain. So we came up with this task back when I was in graduate school, and it's called the chatroom task. And the chatroom task allowed us essentially to look at your brain on rejection. There was also acceptance thrown in there too. But what I specifically wanted to look at was, in these adolescent girls, how were their brains responding to finding out that they were liked and finding out that they weren't liked? And how was that different between girls who had chronic experiences of peer victimization in the years leading up to this versus girls who had not? So not only was I looking at neural responses to acceptance and rejection, I was also looking at histories, social histories, and individual differences. So it was kind of fun. We'd bring them into the lab, and we would tell them, you're going to do this visit, and at the end of the visit, you are going to be matched with somebody. You are going to have a chance to basically swipe right or swipe left on a group of peers you've never seen or met before, and they are all over the country, so there's no chance that you could have met them. So we would tell them, here's the map, and so we have these different study sites around the country where other adolescents are doing this task, and you get to see their faces, and you get to decide who you like and who you don't like. And later on, we'll match you with one of them, and you get to chat, ostensibly. In reality, they weren't going to, but we led them to believe that they were, and then at the end, we debriefed them to make the experiment clear to them. So they would get to look at these different pictures of peers and decide whether they liked or didn't like each one. They would do this 60 times, so they would choose 30 that they liked, 30 that they didn't. So I always love to kind of critique my own research, and so one critique that you might come up with right away when I tell you this is, well, if you have to choose 30 you like and 30 you don't like, what if you don't like anybody? Well, we made them choose. Just do the best you can, we would say. We would also tell them, everyone that you rated is going to get a chance to rate you. And then you're actually going to get to learn whether they liked you or not. And so we send them home after they do the matching. And then when they come back a few days later, we put them into the MRI, and each peer that they chose, we put it on the screen, and we remind them, you said you liked this person. You said you didn't like this person. Then they receive feedback. This person liked you. This person did not like you. Or this person did not get a chance to rate you. Controls are really important in experimental research. Yeah.
Are they selecting based on a picture, or is there any information with the picture?
They were selecting on the picture only. I'm glad you asked that, because there's another wrinkle to the experiment. When they came in and they rated, they actually filled out a profile with likes and dislikes, information about themselves, basically like they were making a bio. And we wanted to keep the experiment tightly controlled and not introduce too many variables. And so what we would tell them was, oh, darn, we wanted you to see these other profiles, but it's not working, so you're just going to have to decide based on the pictures. It was really uncomfortable to lie. But with social research, you have to weigh the benefits and the costs of deception. And so this went through strict institutional review, where we had to sort of justify our decision to do that. And we had to go through an extensive debriefing process with these youth afterward. Because not only were they being deceived into thinking they were actually going to talk to somebody, but they were experiencing something that's very emotionally salient to teenagers. They were finding out whether people liked them or not. I mean, that can be really scary. Yeah.
For each of the pictures, was the individual smiling?
Yeah. We tried to keep the valence of the face consistent. Valence meaning they're all smiling, they're all looking pleasant. Yeah. And then we would ask them to rate how they felt. So after each piece of feedback, did you feel really bad about that? Did you feel great? And so the MRI portion allowed us to look at what's happening in their brain as they are telling us whether they feel really bad or really good about that experience. And this is what I found. It's a complex slide to make a simple point. What I found was that the more frequently these girls had been victimized across adolescence, the more suppressed or blunted their brain response was to social evaluation. In other words, there was this negative association between past experiences of victimization by peers and brain activation. And in particular, where we saw differences in that brain activation was in that region of the brain I talked about earlier that's still developing, that prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating emotions, among other functions. And you can see that in the chart on the left here as well. That reddish area is where we saw peak activation in the brain. So that's the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain for cognitive control. Now, what made our finding really interesting was that the types of evaluation that these girls cared about the most, at least when you peek inside the brain, were the ones where there was non-mutual liking. I thought that they were just going to show this blunted response when they were being rejected. I thought, nobody's going to care about being liked. It's really that social rejection that's going to carry the weight. But it turns out that when you're a teenager and you don't like somebody, and you find out that they like you, and you find out that they found out that you don't like them, that's really stressful. It can be even more stressful than just a mutual no. If you've ever had to turn down a date who really is into you, you know this experience. And so there was something about non-mutual liking, liking people who didn't like you, not liking people who did like you, that was really emotionally powerful in these girls. But among these girls who had exposure to frequent peer victimization, we saw a blunting of this effect. The inference we made is that there might be something about chronic exposure to social stress earlier in adolescence that kind of forces the brain to shut down in a way. When you see this blunted signaling, it could mean that it's a protective mechanism, that the brain is learning to sort of withdraw from social experiences and try not to invest in it so much. It's one interpretation. Yeah?
Did you also measure, excuse me, did you also measure stress hormones at all?
We did not look at hormones in this project. Yeah. So the take home here, my simple point from the complex slide, we have some initial evidence from our chatroom study that chronic social stress in early adolescence is in some way correlated with prefrontal brain function in later adolescence. There is a clear through line from the social experiences we have at that onset of puberty, that onset of adolescence, at the time when our brains are maximally sensitive to social information. Now, I have a second example on risk-taking. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead and talk about some current and future directions in my own research, but it relates to this topic of risk-taking. The current project that I'm working on is looking at cannabis use outcomes. It's a really timely topic, and one of the reasons why the National Institute of Health that granted me the money did so is because, as many of us know, it's becoming recreationally legal in more states year to year. And as it's becoming normalized, as we're starting to see more ads around it, we're also starting to see differences, an uptick in use among adolescents. And in fact, substance use is going down in teens among all classes of substance except for marijuana. Marijuana is the only substance that isn't decreasing in teens, and there might be something about the availability and the low perception of risk that's driving those decisions. And so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is what is motivating adolescents to initiate use? We know that most teens begin to use cannabis in peer contexts. Most of the time, the first time that you have a drug, it's in a group or with a friend. It's rarely something that you do when you are alone. And so an interesting question arises when we think about the sensitivity that the developing brain has to social acceptance. What's motivating people to begin using? What is the primary driver? Is it the desire to have the high of the drug and to experience the effects of the drug itself? Or is it more related to the social pressures and the social influence? Both of those things can be really rewarding in the adolescent brain. Both of those things can serve as reinforcers in the brain. And in fact, the part of the brain that is responsible for reward processing, that limbic system I told you about, that's super active in the teen years, has a lot of dopaminergic tissue in it, and cannabinoid receptors. So the very part of the brain that propels youth towards social experiences, social rewards, and high sensation-seeking experiences is also, it overlaps a lot with the part of the brain that is full of cannabinoid receptors. So it becomes really tricky to try to figure out what's the primary driver of decisions to use. Is it the social experience, or is it the drug itself? And there can be many different reasons why people decide to use in the first place. Some teens decide to take up use because they just want to know what it feels like, but then they're with their friends, and so you get this intersection of both rewards, kind of ratcheting each other up. Other teens might decide to use because maybe they're going to a party and they know that cannabis is going to calm them down. Maybe they have a lot of social anxiety and they just want to have an experience that's a little more chill. And so again, the reward might be social, but the influence of the drug is that it brings you into a space where you can engage better. Higher substance use is also correlated with chronic experiences of social rejection. And so we know minoritized youth are more likely to use substances than non-minoritized youth. Another coping mechanism, another social motivation for use is coping with negative peer experiences. And so as a neuroscientist, one of the open questions that's really driving my research is what part of the brain is the driver in decisions to use? Is it the rewarding part of the brain, or is it the part of the brain that is trying to regulate emotions and cope with negative peer experiences? So I've started some pilot projects to try to tease apart these variables. And ultimately, the goal here is to develop and improve prevention and intervention programming around youth who have substance use disorders and who are using in problematic ways. And so the next step for my research is to try to figure out what are some of the active ingredients in effective interventions for teens. The traditional model of a substance use intervention for teens for a long time was based on cognitive behavioral training and on planning for the future. Most of these interventions that have currently sort of held the most or been the most popular are the ones that really focus on the prefrontal cortex. Often they don't work very well, and one of the reasons we think that we're sort of learning from the neuroscience that it's not working well is that it turns out that teens can sit down with a mental health counselor and come up with all of the reasons why they need to reduce their use. But then when you get out into the real world, your decision-making process changes. Suddenly you're with friends. And as we know, the adolescent brain is processing risks and rewards differently when you're in social contexts than it does when you're sitting down in a clinical environment with a counseling psychologist or a mental health provider. And so the new developing trend in interventions is to try to harness the power of peer influence. Instead of doing one-on-one counseling sessions, there's more of a focus on peer-guided and peer-facilitated substance use counseling. Turns out teens listen to their friends more than adults, is the simple way of making this, bringing in the neuroscience. But now we know a little bit more about the why. Because the adolescent brain can process risk and rewards so differently when friends are around, those are things that are going on at lower levels in the brain that they're often not even aware of. And so the brain is giving us this new window into their decision-making process that they may not even be aware of. And so I have my own frequently asked questions, but because we have about 8 minutes left, why don't I turn the floor over to you and allow you to ask your own. So the question was, are we seeing some demographic trends in the heavy cannabis users? The data actually show that youth from higher income communities are more likely to be using cannabis. So that's a different question. So instead of looking at what about the developing brain motivates us to begin using, the question is, if you begin using early, what is it going to do to your brain? Am I interpreting your question right? Or is there an impact of use? Yeah, right now the developing wisdom for parents who want to know this answer is delay as long as you can, because the younger that youth begin substances, including cannabis, the stronger the neurocognitive impact, meaning it's correlated with lower cognitive functioning in adulthood. They're also at higher risk for developing use disorders later on. Yeah, so beginning using impacts the developing brain according to our current data. I will say, looking at the data from the past 4 years, it's really been going down, especially in regions where it's recreationally legal. And so state by state, it differs. In Oregon, as of about 2016, 2017, the average age was around 14. Now it's going down. Yeah. How did they get the statistics and how do we know they're accurate? Every year, there is a national report that goes out. It's called the Youth Behavior Survey. And they do random samples of youth throughout the country. How do we know that they're being accurate? We don't always know. There are always trade-offs with how we gather information, and with any survey, you have to take the risk that people are going to give the answer that they think you want them to give instead of the one that is the truth. You have to try to keep it as confidential and anonymous as possible. When we brought in our teens, because it's illegal behavior under 21 in Oregon, we had to tell them over and over and over again, if you do this study, it's going to be totally confidential. Nothing will be reported to the authorities. There's not going to be any chance that any of your personal information will be shared with anyone outside of the study. At what age does stress have the biggest impact? Yeah, it's a question I've gotten a few times. And my general answer to that is there tend to be 2 sensitive periods in the life course. And the first and the most important one is early childhood. If you're going to intervene, then early childhood is the best time to do it. That is when the brain is maximally flexible and malleable, or what we call plastic. But adolescence is the second period. And so this is a time when, because of those changing, the reorganization of the brain, we become more susceptible to stressful experiences. But there are individual differences in that. Some people are dandelions. They can thrive in any environment. They might not ever be that pretty, but they can generally weather the storm okay. And other people are orchids, and they, given the right nurturing, they can be the most beautiful flower. But orchids are also very sensitive, and so in the wrong environment, they're going to fall off that high wire. I love mixed metaphors. And so at what age does stress have the biggest impact? Early childhood and adolescence, but it depends on the plasticity or the flexibility in the brain, and some people are more adaptable than others with that.